Hello everybody, welcome back to another exciting edition of Ed Puzzle Lecture Notes. Today we're going to go into reflexes, and here's our daily objective. Describe the path of a reflex arc from the stimulus to the response. So I think we all kind of have an idea of what a reflex is, but just by this objective and what we're doing today, that makes me kind of think of short answer question. So, I have no idea. I haven't looked at your exam since last year, but this just looks like something that could become a short answer question on your test. So, you might want to be able to describe this process. Alright, so what is a reflex? Well, first they happen automatically, and they're very fast responses to some sort of environmental changes. So basically, they are involuntary responses. So these are things that do not require any conscious thoughts. They happen all by themselves. Some are inborn, so you have them since birth. Some of them you actually lose, after you're a newborn. And some are acquired. And what we're going to talk about first are these spinal reflexes. Now this is some type of stimulus which stimulates the peripheral nervous system, and the spinal cord makes the decision itself. So usually that information is passed on to the brain, and then the brain makes the decision what response is required. But these require a fast, automatic response. So the spinal cord actually bypasses the brain and sends the response itself. Now the brain will find out about it, but it's after the reflex has already occurred. And that's what a reflex arc is. So it goes straight from the sensory receptors to the spinal cord, and then instead of going up to the brain, it's going to relay that information through an efferent neuron right back to the effector to provide an immediate response. And here are a couple classic somatic reflexes, which is involuntary contraction of skeletal muscles. And I know you guys know a lot of these. You've probably done them at the doctor's office or whatever. The one is the patellar reflex. I think we will do this in class in one of our labs. That's where you tap the patellar tendon, or the patellar ligament actually. This causes sensory receptors in the quadriceps to notice that that muscle, it's basically your thigh muscle, is being stretched. So in response to that, without any input from your brain, your leg will extend, or you'll kind of give a little easy kick to relieve that stretching of the quadriceps muscle. Now it's what's called monosynaptic. Now I think you can probably figure out what that means just by the word. Mono means one, synaptic means synapse. So this has to do with a sensory neuron having one synapse with a motor neuron, which then elicits the response of kind of kicking your leg. And doctors do this to test your femoral nerve, see if it's working properly. The withdrawal reflex, they do not do this one in your doctor's office, but if you touch something that's very hot, your hand will pull back, your arm will pull back automatically without you having to think about it, because you need to get your hand out of there very, very quick, so it bypasses the brain. Same thing with your eyes closing. So if something is approaching your eyes, they close without your brain even having to tell them, because it's a reflex. And this helps to prevent injury. And another one is called the plantar reflex. That's where they use what's called a percussion hammer. It's like a little rubber mallet, you've seen it, where they'll rub it along the lateral foot sole surface, and that causes your toes to automatically curl under. And that's the plantar reflex. And I think we will do that one as well in our lab. And here's a diagram of the patellar reflex. So here is the percussion hammer, which is being lightly tapped on what's called the patellar tendon here. I've seen it called both ways. Ligaments go bone to bone. The patellar tendon's kind of a different one. But anyways, when it gets tapped, this muscle spindle right here, which it notices that the quadricep muscle is being stretched. It stimulates this afferent neuron to fire an action potential. So that's how this action potential travels down along the axon. It comes into the spinal cord. And what you see here is it comes in through the back. So this is the back. So that comes in what's called the dorsal or posterior root. So it comes in the dorsal or posterior root. This is the cell body of that afferent neuron. So that's a cluster of cell bodies. So this right here would be what's called the dorsal root ganglion. Dorsal root ganglion. So remember, ganglion, that's a cluster of cell bodies located outside of the central nervous system. All right, so that axon's action potential finally reaches the synapse right here. It releases neurotransmitters into the synapse. Remember, this is the gray area right here. This is the white area on the outside of the spinal cord. Well, those neurotransmitters are excitatory, and they cause an action potential to go down this axon of this efferent neuron, which innervates or connects to your thigh muscles called your quadriceps. Now that motor neuron, that efferent neuron, releases the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. So it releases acetylcholine into the muscle, and that's what causes it to contract, which causes your leg to slightly kick. But what you need to know is, you can see that the brain does get this information. This information is relayed to your brain. Obviously, you can feel if a little hammer hits you in the knee. You can feel that. But it was your spinal cord that conducted this reflex, that made this response happen, because the brain didn't even find out about it until the spinal cord had already relayed that information to the effector, to the muscle. And also see that sensory information comes through the dorsal or posterior route, where motor information exits through the ventral or the anterior route. And now this is basically what I just said, just in word form. So if you happen to see this question on your exam and it's a short answer / essay question, these are the things you're going to want it to include. It starts out with the sensory receptors. So that could be a Ruffini ending that's sensing heat, or maybe some free nerve endings which senses some sort of pain. Doesn't matter, but some sort of sensory receptor senses some sort of stimulus that requires an immediate response. Well, that sensory receptor is connected to a sensory neuron, and that's going to carry the impulse to the central nervous system or the spinal cord. And precisely, it takes it to the gray matter of the spinal cord, what's in the middle, which makes kind of like that H in the middle of the spinal cord. That's the gray matter. So that's going to be made up of synapses and some cell bodies. Remember, the white matter is around it. That's going to be myelinated axons. And that gray matter of the spinal cord is what's called the integrating center. So that's what's making the decision that, hey, we need to make a response right now. So that could be the synapse between the sensory and motor neuron themselves. That would be monosynaptic. Or there could be some interneurons in between. Either way, what really matters is that information is not sent to the brain for analysis. It is sent, the stimulation is sent directly to a motor neuron. And that's going to cause a response in a muscle or gland. And that muscle or gland is the effector. The muscle or gland that makes the response to the stimulus, that is the effector. And pretty much the same thing as the previous slide. It's just now we're specific to the patellar reflex. That's when they use that tiny little hammer, tap the patellar ligament or patellar tendon, and then it makes your leg kick. Well, it always starts with a sensory receptor. Some sort of sensory organ senses some sort of stimulus. So it might be pain, it might be heat. In this case, it's the muscle spindles in your muscles which detect the stretch. It detects that your quadriceps, your thigh muscle, is being stretched when your ligament was tapped with the hammer. Well, that information is sent to a sensory neuron or an afferent neuron. Remember, these guys work by sending an action potential. If they're stimulated enough, they'll send an action potential to the spinal cord. That's the integrating center. That's what's going to make the decision here. And remember, sensory information comes in. So if this is your spinal cord and here's the gray matter on the inside, sensory information, this is going to be the back, comes in through the posterior dorsal route. So this would be your back. So sensory information enters through the posterior dorsal route, and then it'll exit. The motor information will go through the anterior or ventral route, and that's how the reflex arc will occur. Remember, a bundle of cell bodies outside of the central nervous system, that's called a ganglion. So that would be the dorsal root ganglion, right there on my little crude drawing. All right, so now on to after the integrating center makes its decision to kick your leg, that information is sent by an action potential through a motor or an efferent neuron, which travels to the effector, in this case, your quadriceps muscle. And that neuron is going to release acetylcholine, if you remember that neurotransmitter. It releases acetylcholine into the muscle, which causes it to contract, which causes it to kick. All right, so now it's time for a brain break. I know these notes are not that long, but might as well take a break anyway. All right, what real invention allows someone to see through a brick wall? And this is something that really has been invented. I don't know if you guys, I'm pretty sure you've heard of it, but what invention allows someone to see through a brick wall? See if you can get that. And the answer, of course, is a window. All right, so a couple examples of these are what's called learned or conditioned reflexes. So these are reflexes that you learn or condition throughout your life. So one is driving. Now, most of you guys are driving, I'm guessing, and if you notice, sometimes you can drive to work or to school or wherever, and you get there and you don't even remember how you got there. That's because many of the maneuvers and the little moves you make with the steering wheel and the gas pedal and the brake pedal, those have become conditioned reflexes. You can do them with very little or no conscious thought. So basically when you're driving, you're not thinking of every little minute, little tiny change you do to the steering wheel. Those are things that just happen pretty much automatically that you've learned from many years of driving. Starting blocks. So even though our hearing might be the same, track athletes can get a jump off the starting blocks faster than somebody who's not a track athlete because they've conditioned that reflex. Pavlov's dogs. Those of you that are in AP psychology, I'm sure you've heard of them. They were conditioned to salivate by the ring of a bell. So what Pavlov did was, he rang a bell and then he'd present them with food. That would cause the dog to salivate. Well, eventually the dogs would salivate even without the food. They would salivate just from the ring of the bell. Also boxers. Boxers are able to dodge punches basically without even thinking about it because those are conditioned reflexes. All right, now some cranial reflexes. So these are reflexes that originate in part of the brain, and they're going to originate in what's called the brain stem. So the three parts of the brain stem from inferior to superior, from the bottom to the top, the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the most superior part of the brain stem is called the midbrain. So once again, like all reflexes, these are things that happen all by themselves. You do not have to consciously think about these things in order for them to happen. So one thing is eyes tracking. So as you're reading a book and you're reading back and from one side to the next, keep reading. The tracking of the words from left to right, you do not have to concentrate on that. It happens automatically. Same thing with pupil dilation. So if someone shines a bright light in your eyes, your pupils will contract. The little pupil in your eye will get smaller to allow less light in. Well, if it gets dark, then your pupils will actually dilate. The little dot in the middle of your eye actually gets wider to allow more light in. Head and neck reflexes, swallowing, don't have to think about it. Most people have, that's now a reflex, learned, conditioned reflex. Gagging or coughing, the hiccups. Obviously, hiccups are hard to get rid of. So, you don't have to think about doing a hiccup. It happens all by itself. All right, the last slide. I'm not really going to give you an answer to this, but I want you to think about it. And who knows, maybe it'll be a short answer question on your test. But why does damage to the spinal cord usually result in lifelong paralysis below the site of injury? So this is Christopher Reeve. He fell off a horse, it must have been 20 years ago now, and that gave him lifelong paralysis. Well, why? Why is it lifelong? What is it about the spinal cord and nerves which makes that a lifelong injury? All right, that's all I got for you. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.